Welcome to Japan True Stories. Tonight, a quiet story from Japan. Settle in. Some stories settle into memory the way snowfall settles on a winter garden. Slowly, silently, in the small hours when no one is watching and nothing is asked of the world. For a man we will call Hiroshi, the settling came in the months after his 30th year, when he began to notice that his wife seemed to carry a different kind of quiet than the one he had always known in her. She had always been someone who moved through their small apartment in Chiba with measured ease, preferring the low sound of the television to long conversation, folding laundry in the evening without speaking, and finding in that silence a contentment that seemed, to him, entirely genuine. He had loved that about her. The particular stillness she brought into a room, the sense she gave him that nothing was required of their life together beyond what they already had. And so, when the stillness shifted into something else, something sealed and slightly turned away from him, he noticed it the way you notice a change in the light on an overcast afternoon, without quite being able to name what is altered, only knowing that something has. It began as a small thing, a habit he could not account for. She would take her telephone calls not at the kitchen table, where she always had, but on the narrow balcony outside, standing in the cold of February with her coat still on, her breath making small, careful clouds in the winter air. He did not ask about it immediately, because in Japan and in marriages, there is a patience that resembles trust, that sometimes is trust, and sometimes merely resembles it from a certain comfortable distance. The weeks passed in the way weeks do in a shared life. The sound of the evening news, the smell of dinner on the stove, the ritual of two people who have become so accustomed to each other's presence that they have stopped fully noticing it. He found himself paying attention to things he had not paid attention to before, a name that appeared more than once in her messages, glimpsed on a Sunday morning when she left her phone face up on the kitchen table, the way she smiled at something on a screen before turning it over, quickly, as if catching herself doing something she had not meant to be seen. In March, she mentioned, almost in passing, that she had started attending something on weekends, a music gathering, she called it informal, a group of people who cared about independent artists and the kind of music that does not often reach the radio. He had nodded and returned to his dinner, and the conversation moved on to other things, as conversations do when both people are quietly deciding, perhaps without knowing it, how much they wish to understand. The apartment at night was very quiet in those weeks, and he would lie awake, sometimes listening to the rain against the window, that gentle and persistent sound, feeling the particular loneliness of someone who is beginning to understand something they have not yet put into words. The tatami in the hallway made a small sound in the cold, as old tatami does, and the wind moved past the building with its low and inattentive murmur, and Hiroshi lay still and looked at the ceiling and waited, without quite knowing what he was waiting for. The truth arrived not with drama, but with the quiet accumulation of documentation, the kind that gathers in a household where two people have begun, almost imperceptibly, to live in slightly different directions. A receipt left on the kitchen counter, a name and a message he had not meant to read, a photograph on the phone that answered a question he had not known, until that moment, that he was asking. He sat with what he had found for a long time that afternoon, in the stillness of the apartment, with the sound of traffic from the road below coming in faintly through the balcony door, and the smell of the city in the rain. The other man, the one whose name had appeared in those messages, whose face was in that photograph, had a life that Hiroshi had not known about, and that he was now, slowly, coming to understand in more detail than he would have chosen. There is a great deal that could be said about this other man, and some of it was simply ordinary. He lived somewhere in the city, he had a job of some kind, he was perhaps a few years older than Hiroshi, and he had, like many people, a private dream he had been carrying for some time, and that he believed that spring was close to its fulfillment. The dream was music, a career in music, specifically the kind built on recorded songs and quiet live performances, and the hope that one's particular arrangement of sounds will find, eventually, an audience that is waiting for exactly them. He had spent money on that dream, on recording sessions in a small studio somewhere in the city, on the production of an actual compact disc, a physical object pressed in a limited run, with a photograph on the front and inside, the careful typography of someone who believes they are making something that will matter. When Hiroshi eventually learned about the compact disc, this detail stayed with him in a way he had not anticipated, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was so recognizably human, so filled with the particular species of hope that does not always pause to assess the ground it stands on before moving forward. Someone had wanted something very much, and had moved toward it in the way that people do with money, with time, with the quiet and often unexamined conviction that the strength of the wanting is itself sufficient proof of the deserving. He could almost, in a certain light, find something in that worth feeling gently toward. Almost. He called a lawyer in April, a woman with a direct manner and a small office near the station, lined with the specific kind of books that legal offices contain, their spines very upright and very serious. She explained his situation with a measured clarity that he found, under the circumstances, an enormous relief, the particular comfort of someone who knows exactly where they are and can tell you precisely what the land looks like from here. Under Japanese civil law, she told him, the obligation to pay damages for marital infidelity rested jointly and clearly on both parties, on his wife and on the other man, and the amount she named was specific, and it was not small. Hiroshi sat with this information for a moment, looking at the small succulent on the windowsill behind her desk, a patient green thing in a terracotta pot, and understood something that had not fully assembled itself for him until that moment. The compact disc, the recording sessions, the promotional materials, all of it had been funded in the assumption that the past would simply stay where it had been left, that no one would come looking for an accounting, that the situation would resolve itself the way uncomfortable things sometimes do, by simply losing its momentum and falling away. It was an assumption that had now encountered the law, and the law, as it happens, had a different view of the matter entirely. The proceedings that followed took place in the careful procedural language of civil courts. Letters sent through solicitors, responses received, Hearings attended in rooms where the light was fluorescent and the carpet was gray, and the air had the particular quality of official spaces that have absorbed many long afternoons. Hiroshi was not someone who found conflict comfortable, and the process required him to maintain a steadiness that did not come naturally, a kind of patient persistence that he had to practice. The way you practice something unfamiliar, imperfectly at first, and then with more reliability, and then simply as a thing you do. His wife and the other man, for their part, had not immediately understood the direction things were moving in, and this misunderstanding had led them both to continue as if the spring might still go the way they had imagined it would. There had been, from their side, an assumption, perhaps that the compensation would not be seriously pursued, or that it would be reduced significantly, or that the whole matter would simply dissolve under the pressure of time and inaction. The other man had continued, through those spring months, to make plans, continued spending on the music career, continued moving in the direction of the debut he still believed was approaching, still carrying the compact disc forward toward whatever audience he had imagined was out there, waiting. His wife had not discouraged any of this, and the two of them had moved through the season in the particular confidence of people who have not yet fully registered the shape of the situation they are living in. The understanding arrived in stages, as understanding tends to, first as a letter, then as a number, then as the slow recognition that the number was real and the letter had not gone away, and that neither of them were going to. The formal notification arrived through proper channels, naming both of them and specifying the amount. And after that, the season took on a slightly different quality, the warmth of spring carrying for the people involved a weight it had not carried before. The music career, which had been moving forward in the direction of a debut, began instead to move toward a stillness, not with any dramatic reversal, but with a gradual slowing of something that has met more resistance than it had budgeted for. The compact disc, pressed in its limited run, sat somewhere now in boxes, and Hiroshi, when he thought of it, found he had no particular feeling about exactly where it was. It existed somewhere in the city, holding its songs, waiting in the patient way that physical objects wait, without urgency, without complaint, simply enduring. His wife moved out in the early summer, after conversations that were neither angry nor entirely kind, but had the quality of things said carefully by two people who have reached the edge of something and are choosing their words accordingly. For years, he found himself thinking in the days after she left. For years of evenings and meals and the small accumulated rituals of a shared life. And what he found he missed was not the large abstract idea of the marriage, but the ordinary small texture of it, the familiar sounds in the morning, the way the apartment smelled when she had been cooking. She had made tea a little too strong and a little too sweet, and he had always thought so without ever mentioning it, because it had always seemed like a small thing, the kind of thing not worth raising. And now it was gone, and he noticed its absence in the mornings with a quietness that had no particular name. He sat with that for a while, in a way that you sit with things that cannot be neatly resolved, not forcing them toward clarity, simply letting them be what they are. The proceedings concluded in the autumn, on a day when the ginkgo trees along the avenue outside the courthouse had already turned to that particular gold of late October. The color that in Japan carries a ceremonial quality, as if the year itself is formally acknowledging the passage of what has passed. The compensation was settled and the amounts specified in the documents signed, and the formal language of conclusion read and acknowledged. And then Hiroshi walked out through the glass doors and stood for a moment on the pavement in the afternoon air. The city moved around him with its usual indifference, its particular form of impersonal comfort. The sense that the city does not require anything of you specifically, that it will continue regardless, and that this in certain moments is exactly what is needed. He felt something settle in him as he stood there. Not quite relief, not quite grief, but something that lived between them in the space where exhaustion and resolution sometimes briefly meet before moving apart. The other man had paid his portion, and the music career, in the form it had taken through that long year, had not come to pass. At least not in that season, not in that particular version of the story. Hiroshi was fair-minded enough to understand that futures are not decided by single seasons, that people find their way back to their ambitions by different routes, that the compact disc might still find someone who would press play and listen to what was on it. But the plan as it had existed in the spring, built on the assumption that the past as a country one can simply leave without paying the crossing fee. That plan was finished in the quiet way that plans built on wishful arithmetic tend to finish, without ceremony or announcement. He stopped at a convenience store on the way home and bought a small can of coffee and a packet of sesame crackers, and he sat on a bench near the station and watched the early evening commuters pass. Their faces the faces of people moving efficiently from one part of their day to another, each one the center of a story he knew nothing about. Tokyo moved around him as it always does, without requirement, without comment, and he drank the coffee slowly and found it good. In November, he moved to a smaller apartment in Koenji, a neighborhood he had always been fond of for its secondhand shops and its slightly unhurried quality, for the sense it gave him of a part of the city that had not entirely forgotten how to simply be without always needing to become something else. He bought a few plants for the window and a new kettle and a bookshelf that he assembled on a Sunday afternoon with the window open and the sound of the street coming in, the smell of autumn air, and the distant music from the cafe around the corner. He made miso soup that evening, simple with tofu and wakame, and ate it at the low table by the window and looked out at the street below and felt something that was not happiness exactly, but was perhaps its quieter and more durable relation. The plain, unremarkable fact of being in one's own place, at one's own pace, with nothing more required of the evening than the evening itself. He did not think about the compact disc very often in those months, and when he did, it was with a detachment that surprised him, a mild and wondering curiosity about what songs were on it, whether they were any good, whether the person who had made them had understood, while making them, that something in his life was about to become significantly more complicated. Music is made in the hope of being heard, and that hope does not always know what is approaching on the road behind it. He started cooking more deliberately in the evenings. Rice and grilled fish and the small pickled things that his mother had always kept on the table, the ones he had taken for granted as a child and had never learned to make properly until now, when there was time and quiet and no particular reason to hurry. A colleague at work named Tomoko, who worked in the department next to his and who had the particular quality of listening without interrupting, began joining him for lunch on Wednesdays and then for dinner on occasional Fridays, and then slowly and without pressure for other things as well. He did not hurry any of it. There's a concept in Japanese, ma, a word for the meaningful space between things, the pause that is not emptiness but preparation, the silence that contains what is coming without forcing it to arrive before it is ready. Hiroshi came to think of that year as a kind of ma, a space between versions of his life, and found as the months passed that he was more grateful for the space than he would have predicted at the start of it. The winter came in its usual way, with the particular cold of Tokyo in January, and then the spring returned with the cherry blossoms along the river in Koenji, pale and serious against a sky that had not yet decided whether it was finished with the gray. He had told Tomoko the whole story one evening over dinner. The marriage, the discovery, the other man with his recording sessions and his compact disc and his interrupted plans. And she had listened through all of it without prompting him or filling the silences. And when he finished, she said quietly that she was glad he had come through it. She said it without asking whether he was all right now, which he appreciated, because the question would have implied a doubt that her statement, on its own, did not carry. He was all right, more or less, and had been for some time, and she seemed to understand this without needing to be told, seemed to want only to acknowledge the distance that had been traveled, to name it without requiring him to map it out in full. He did not know what had become of the other man in the time since, whether the music career had found another form, whether the compact disc had found any listeners at all, whether the hope that had gone into making it had found somewhere else to rest. He did not search for any of this online, though he understood that he could have, that the answer was probably a few keystrokes away. Some things earn a kind of distance over time, and wisdom is in part the ability to recognize when a distance has been earned and to leave it where it is settled. His former wife had moved to another city, Sendai. He had heard, though he was not certain, and the last that reached him through mutual acquaintances was that she was working and managing, and he found that he wished her something resembling peace, not with the warmth of lingering feeling, but with the quieter goodwill of someone who has decided that holding on to bitterness costs more than it ever repays. That willingness had not come quickly, and he did not pretend that it had. It had come gradually, in the way that most things worth having come, through accumulated small decisions made on ordinary evenings. On a Sunday afternoon in May, nearly 2 years after the formal end of everything, Hiroshi walked to the second-hand shop 2 streets from his apartment, a small place, crowded and faintly cedar-smelling, where someone with time and patience had filed hundreds of old compact discs in approximate alphabetical order. He moved through the bins slowly, not looking for anything in particular, simply looking, feeling the familiar texture of all those plastic cases, each one someone's particular hope, someone's careful arrangement of sounds made in the belief that it would find its way to ears that needed it. He did not find a disc by the other man, and had not expected to. But he stood for a while anyway with his fingers resting lightly on the cases, and felt something in him that was not quite pity and not quite kinship, but was perhaps something between them, the recognition of shared human material, even in circumstances that had given him considerable cause for other feelings. He bought 2 discs that afternoon by artists he had never heard, and walked home through the late spring light with the sound of a small festival somewhere in the neighborhood, the smell of yakitori from a stall near the station, the last warmth of the afternoon on his face. He made tea when he arrived home, put the first disc on, and sat by the open window while the music played into the room, gentle and unfamiliar, the voice of someone he would never know singing about something that had once mattered to them greatly. The city was doing what it does in late afternoon, going about its thousands of private stories, each moving alongside the others without quite touching, each one the most important story in the world to the person living it. Somewhere in the city, in a box somewhere, the compact disc still existed, holding its songs in the patient way of things made with effort and hope and not yet heard, or perhaps heard now by someone in circumstances he would never know. And it was fine, unremarkably, quietly, entirely fine. That is perhaps how most stories of this kind find their resting place. Not in a verdict, not in a moment of clean conclusion, but in an ordinary afternoon that contains, without announcing it, all the distance that had to be traveled to arrive there. A cup of tea, and an open window, and a stranger's voice singing about something that once mattered very much to someone somewhere in the city. Hiroshi listened until the disc finished, and then sat in the quiet for a little while, feeling the evening come in through the window the way evenings come, without announcement, without hurry, the city lights appearing one by one in the dust below him, each one its own small warmth in the gathering dark. The compact disc in its boxes somewhere across the city still held its songs and still waited in the patient way of anything made in the hope of being heard, and perhaps that in the end was the most human part of the whole long story. That in the middle of all that confusion and misplaced confidence, someone had still made something, had still pressed sounds into a shape and sent it out into the world hoping it would find a home. The hoping had come before the understanding, as it so often does. And Hiroshi, sitting by the window in the evening light in Koenji, with the last note of an unfamiliar song still softly in the air, found he could hold that alongside everything else, gently, without it costing him anything more. And that, perhaps, is where this part of the story rests tonight, in that small apartment, in that quiet light, with a man who has come through something difficult and found, on the other side of it, the ordinary and sufficient gift of an evening that asks nothing more of him than to simply be in it. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it soften and dissolve the way a dream does when morning is still hours away. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take it now. A slow breath in and a slow breath out. The weight of your body settling a little more deeply into the warmth beneath you. Our next story takes us to a quiet patience that took years to ripen, the kind that grows in silence, the way roots grow in winter, unseen and unhurried beneath the frozen ground. It is a gentle story, and it will find you wherever you are. Some messages arrive the way a slow wind arrives, not with a sound, but with a sensation, a soft awareness that the air around you has shifted in some way you cannot immediately name, and you find yourself sitting very still before you understand why. He was in the middle of a Wednesday evening, somewhere unremarkable and ordinary, when the message came through on his phone. 3 years after the divorce had been signed and witnessed, and he had assumed closed for good. The message was from her, from not Suki, his former wife, and it said something he had not expected to read in what remained of his quiet life. She was asking for the money back. Not all of it, the message went on, and not immediately, but she wanted to meet, and she wanted to speak with him, and the word she used at the end was onagai, a gentle, old-fashioned way of asking, the kind that carries something heavier than a simple request. He read the message slowly, then set his phone face down on the low table and sat for a while in the silence of his apartment, listening to the sound of the city below, that soft and constant murmur that never entirely stops, like something breathing in its sleep. 3 years is a long time, and in 3 years a man can reconstruct himself, or at least reconstruct the surface of himself. The version that goes to work and eats dinner alone and reads unexpected messages without flinching more than a little. The divorce had not been a kind one, as so few divorces are, though he remembered it now with the softened quality that time tends to apply to even the sharpest things, the way a stone worn in a river loses its edges without losing its weight. She had asked for a settlement when the marriage ended, and he had paid it, and a legal professional had processed the paperwork in a quiet office in the city. And then one gray afternoon in autumn, she was simply no longer in his life. The way a season ends, not with ceremony, but with a slow and steady cooling. He had not wished her any particular harm in the years that followed, which is perhaps the most honest thing that could be said about his feelings toward her. And with that, he had moved his belongings to a smaller apartment in a different part of the city and begun the long, unhurried work of living alone. The message asked him to meet her at a family restaurant near Shinagawa Station, a chain place with orange booth seats and laminated menus, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes the hour feel later than it is, that makes everyone look a little more tired than they might otherwise appear. He arrived several minutes early, as was his habit, and ordered a coffee he did not especially want, and looked out through the window at the street, where the evening rain was just beginning to arrive, small and steady, the kind of rain that settles in and stays for hours. Tokyo in light rain has a quality all its own. The way the pavement darkens in patches, the way the neon storefronts begin to bloom and ripple in the shallow puddles, the way people on the streets slow their pace, as though the rain has gently reminded them that there is no particular urgency. He watched all of this for a while, turning his coffee cup once or twice in his hands, and then the door of the restaurant opened and Natsuki came in. He almost did not recognize her, and there was a moment, brief, suspended, where something in him had to pause and recalibrate, looking again at the woman crossing the tiled floor toward the booth where he sat. She was considerably thinner than he remembered, and her coat, a dark, practical coat with no ornamentation, the kind bought for warmth rather than appearance, belonged entirely to the life she had made after him, a life he had no part of and could only guess at. Her hair was shorter now, and there was something watchful and careful in the way she held herself, a quality he did not associate with the woman he had known, who had always moved through shared spaces with a kind of easy confidence. She found him, and she came to the table, and she sat down, and for a moment neither of them spoke, which is not unusual when two people who once shared a home and a kitchen and the ordinary rhythms of a life find themselves across from each other in a public place. The waitress came and not Suki order a hot tea, speaking softly, her voice a tone or two lower than he remembered it. And when the waitress left, she placed her hands flat on the table and looked at them rather than at him, gathering herself. She told him, slowly and with great care, that she had remarried after the divorce. Not immediately, but within the first year, and that the man she had married was someone introduced through a mutual acquaintance, someone who had presented, at the time, as a reasonable and steady person. The second marriage had not held. She admitted, her voice even and without particular color, her eyes still on her hands. There had been financial difficulties, not the ordinary and manageable kind that most people navigate at some point, but the slow accumulating kind that gather quietly behind a closed door for months and then open it all at once like water that has finally found its way through a crack in a wall. Her second husband had borrowed money from sources that were not especially careful about their arrangements. And when the obligations came due, he had, in the way of such situations, made himself very difficult to locate. She had found herself alone again, but this time without the settlement money, which had been spent in the ordinary, unremarkable way that money is spent on the costs of beginning over again. Rent, a deposit, furniture, the first months of a new life. She was not asking him to take on what was owed. She said quietly, pausing before she continued. She understood that what she was asking was unusual, possibly unfair, possibly something he would simply decline before she had finished explaining. She was asking because she did not know who else to ask, and because, and here she paused again for a longer time, looking at the window rather than at her hands, she had come to feel, in the years since the divorce, that she had not been entirely fair to him. The coffee had grown cool without him noticing, and the rain outside had settled into its quiet, unhurried pattern against the glass, and he sat with what she had said for a moment, letting it move through him the way rain moves through dry ground, slowly finding its level. It is a particular kind of moment when someone from your past offers something like a softening, not quite an apology, not quite an explanation, but something that acknowledges, without requiring anything back, the weight of what passed between you. He had imagined this meeting in the days between her message and the present evening as something with edges, a confrontation at minimum, or a negotiation of some difficult kind, the specific awkwardness of two people who ended badly trying to conduct adult business. But sitting across from her in the orange booth with its fluorescent light and its laminated menu, he found that the edges he had quietly prepared himself for were simply not there, and in their place was something closer to two people who were very tired, sitting in the same warm room out of the rain. He asked her a few things carefully, and she answered them, and they talked for a while in the particular way that people talk when they have decided, without quite saying so, to be honest with each other, not confessional, not dramatic, but plain. She had found a position at a small office in Kawasaki. She mentioned administrative work, nothing with any grandeur to it, but steady enough to cover the essential things, the rent and the groceries and the monthly minimum on what she owed. She was managing, she observed softly, not well, not comfortably, but she was managing, and she was not there to ask to be rescued, only to ask for a little room. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. This woman who had once known which cabinet held his medications, which side of the sink he preferred, the particular noise his coat made on the hook by the door. And he thought about what it means for things to change so completely, so silently, over the course of ordinary years. The settlement itself, the amount he had paid when the marriage dissolved, was not something he had kept waiting in a drawer, preserved. It had been spent in the slow and unremarkable way that money is always spent, absorbed into rent and repairs, and a trip one spring to see his parents in Niigata, where the snow on the mountains was still heavy and very white. And yet sitting there in the restaurant with the rain at the window and her hands folded on the table, what mattered to him was not the strict accounting of it, not the fairness of the arrangement in any precise sense, but something quieter, some wish that a life they had once shared not leave only damage in its wake. He told her that he would think about it, and she nodded, and she did not press him further, which he noticed and which meant something to him. She had come with no leverage, no threat, no particular angle. Only the facts of her situation laid out plainly in the tired light of a public place, and the asking itself, which had taken, he understood, considerable quiet courage. On the train home, he stood near the sliding door and watched the city move past outside. The bright platform lights of each station, the darker neighborhoods between, the occasional soft glow of a convenience store, the dark shape of a temple gate half visible through the still falling rain. He found himself thinking about Natsuki, not with anger, which surprised him, and not with the particular bruised sadness that had characterized the first long year after the divorce, but with something more distant and more gentle, the quality with which you remember a place you once lived and left and will not return to. The divorce had been painful, and the settlement had felt at the time like an injustice, but injustices he had come to understand in the time since have a way of growing smaller when viewed from a sufficient distance, not because they were unreal, but because so much else has happened in the meanwhile. He had built a life in the quiet and workmanlike way that people do, and the life he had built was not unhappy, a little solitary, perhaps quieter than he might have chosen in his younger years, but genuinely his own, which is not a small thing. Back in his apartment, he made a cup of tea and sat at the small table by the window, looking out at the rain, which was still falling, steady and without hurry, the sound of it against the glass very soft, almost like a voice that is not saying anything in particular, only present. He was not certain, even then, what he would decide, whether to help her in some partial way, or to wish her well quietly and let the whole chapter close without further addition. What he was certain of was simpler, that sitting across from her in that restaurant, he had not felt what he had expected to feel. He had expected something with an edge to it, some satisfaction, perhaps, in the particular way that satisfaction sometimes arrives when someone who caused you difficulty is seen to be struggling. And instead he had found only a kind of tired sympathy, the sort that does not require the other person to have earned it. There's something worth noticing in that, he thought, turning his cup slowly in his hands. Something about what the years do to even the sharpest grievances and what they leave behind when they are done. He thought about his parents in Niigata, who had been married for more than 4 decades and who still argued gently over minor things and still, in the mornings, made each other tea without being asked. The small kindnesses so old they had become invisible. He thought about a colleague at work who had gone through a bitter divorce of his own and who had carried the weight of it for years afterward. The specific heaviness of an old grievance maintained, and how much of that man's energy had been given over to sustaining an unhappiness that no longer served any purpose. He did not want to be the person with that weight in his coat pocket. In the days that followed, he arrived at a decision. He would send her a modest amount. Not everything she had asked about, not a gesture of absolution or forgiveness, but enough to give her, as she had said, a little room to breathe. He made the transfer without ceremony, without a long message attached. Only a brief and neutral note, plain and warm in the way of plain things, saying that he hoped her situation would settle soon. She replied the same evening with a message that was equally brief. A thank you, simply worded without elaboration, the kind of message that holds exactly what it means and no more. And he read it once and set his phone down and went to make dinner. It was a simple meal, the kind he made on ordinary evenings for no one in particular. And he ate it at his small table while the rain, which had been falling all day, finally relented, and the city outside the window settled into its quieter nighttime register. He did not hear from her again after that, and this felt appropriate, not as an absence, not as a wound, but as the natural and fitting conclusion to something that had been waiting without either of them quite knowing it, to conclude. The money had not been the true subject of the conversation in that orange booth near Shinagawa Station. He had come to understand. The true subject had been the sitting across from each other, the looking at what time had made of the thing that was once a marriage and a shared life. Marriages end in many ways, and some of those ways leave clean cuts, and some leave the slower kind of mark that takes years to fully understand. And even then, the understanding tends to arrive quietly, without announcement, in the middle of an ordinary evening. What he had understood, sitting in the restaurant with his cooling coffee and the rain moving steadily against the glass, was that Natsuki was a person who had made difficult choices and was living with the long results of them, which was in some larger and quieter sense, not so different from anyone. He too had made his choices and was living with their results. A smaller apartment, a quieter life, evenings that belonged entirely to himself. And he had found, in the time since the divorce, that such a life is not the diminished thing can appear to be from the outside. There is a particular freedom and simplicity he had come to feel in the way the evenings after work are genuinely restful, in the way small pleasures have space enough to be noticed. A good cup of tea, the sound of rain on the window, a book left on the table from the night before. He had not expected, when the marriage dissolved, to find his way to something resembling contentment. And yet here he was, in his small apartment, at his table, with his tea and the city softening below into the quiet dark of an ordinary night. The message from Natsuki, the one that had come 3 years after the divorce on an unremarkable Wednesday, had unsettled him in the way that the past is always gently unsettling when it comes back to find you, when it knocks on the door of the life you have made and asks to be looked at once more. But it had also been, in some way he had not anticipated, a kind of closing, the soft and unhurried turning of a page that had been left half open for longer than either of them had quite realized. Things between them had ended badly, in the way that endings often do when the people involved are tired and hurt and not yet capable of their better selves. But endings have their own long arc, and this one had curved, over time, towards something gentler than either of them might have predicted. Not toward reconciliation. That would be more than the story allows, and not toward formal forgiveness, which requires more ceremony than two people ordering tea in a chain restaurant are likely to manage, but toward something more like recognition. That two people had tried, and the trying had not held, and each of them had gone on, in their own direction, into their own life. He thought sometimes, on evenings like this one, that this was the quietest kind of resolution available to such situations. Not a verdict, not a vindication, not anything that could be written on a legal document, but the simple and slow easing of something that had once been very tight. And on nights when the rain returned and he sat at his window with his tea growing cool, what remained of the whole long story was not anger and not bitterness and not even particularly much sadness. Only something more like the memory of rain. Present once, fully present, and now only a sound in the background, soft and continuous and not unpleasant. And that, perhaps, is where this story rests for tonight, in a small and quiet apartment, in a city settling beneath a clearing sky, a lamp lit low near the window, the last of the evening rain moving on somewhere else, and a man with his cup of tea who has found, without quite looking for it, his way toward peace. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade softly, the way a half-remembered dream dissolves when you reach for it too quickly. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take it. Let your breath slow, let your shoulders settle a little heavier against whatever is holding you. The night is patient, and so are we. Our next story takes us to a memory of someone once loved, a quiet recollection that drifts the way wood smoke drifts on a still evening. Unhurried, gentle, belonging to no particular hour. You don't need to hold on to anything. Simply rest and let the words come to you. She would remember, in the months that followed, how ordinary everything had seemed at first. The morning train, the fluorescent hum of the office corridor, the small rituals of a working day that felt as unremarkable and necessary as breathing. Somewhere in the middle of an ordinary autumn, she had noticed how the lights settled differently in that part of the office where her section chief worked. How the window there faced a small inner courtyard planted with a single persimmon tree. She was a woman in her mid-30s, married some 7 years, living in a 2-room apartment in the quieter part of the city, and her life, she would later reflect, had felt both full and somehow muted, the way a room feels when the blinds are left half-drawn all morning. Her husband worked long hours in a different quarter of the city, and their evenings were pleasant enough. The smell of miso warming on the stove, the soft light of the television, the comfortable silence of two people who had learned each other's rhythms so well that they no longer needed to remark on them. She had not been looking for anything. She would come to understand many years later, and yet something had shifted so slowly, so softly, that she had not noticed the shifting until it was already done. Pause. The section chief was a presence she would define in memory by small gestures, the way he placed documents on her desk without interrupting her concentration, the way he remembered which tea she preferred in the cold months, the way he spoke in a voice that was measured and unhurried. It is a common enough thing. The way proximity becomes warmth and warmth becomes something harder to name, and she would not excuse herself, only observe years afterward that it had happened the way most such things happen, gradually and then without ceremony. The company occupied several floors of a building near a river, and in autumn that river carried a particular smell through the ventilation, something old and green and faintly metallic, and she would associate that smell for the rest of her life with a specific and complicated quality of light. There had been a conference in another city, 3 days in late October, and whatever had been quietly growing between them had, during those 3 days, taken on a form that neither of them had named or, perhaps, fully intended. She had returned home on a Sunday evening, her travel bag heavier than when she left, something in her chest both lighter and more complicated, and her husband had met her at the door with a cup of warm tea and asked, gently, how the conference had gone. Pause. He was a kind man. Her husband, she had always known this, would never have disputed it, even in her most confused and guilty hours. A careful man who folded the newspaper before setting it aside, who checked the weather each morning before she woke, so he could tell her whether to take an umbrella. And it was precisely his kindness that made the months that followed so weighted, so full of a specific and quiet heaviness that she could neither put down nor carry with any ease. The thing between her and the section chief continued through the winter, not dramatically, not recklessly, but with the muted persistence of something that has taken root in a place where it receives just enough light to sustain itself. She was not, by any measure, a careless person. She prided herself on attention, on precision, on returning borrowed things promptly and remembering the names of colleagues' children. And yet she had been careless here, in the one place where precision mattered most. Breath. It was in the early part of the new year that her husband began to notice something, though she would not learn this until much later. Began to notice small absences, small inconsistencies in the texture of her days, the way a careful reader notices when a sentence has been quietly altered. He was not the kind of man to confront directly, not at first. He was the kind of man who sat with things, who turned them quietly in his mind the way one might turn a smooth stone in a stream, feeling for the edges. She remembered, after everything, a particular evening in February when he had asked her very gently whether everything was all right, and she had said yes, of course, and he had nodded and returned to his newspaper, and the kettle had whistled softly in the kitchen, and the evening had continued, and that was all. The discovery, when it came quietly not in a single catastrophic moment, but in the slow accumulation of evidence that eventually becomes undeniable, like water rising so gradually in a room that the inhabitant only notices when it has reached the knees. She never fully understood what it was he had found, or exactly how. Only that one evening in early March, when the plum blossoms had just begun their pale opening outside the apartment window, he was sitting at the low table when she came home, and something in the quality of the room told her immediately that something had changed. Pause. He did not raise his voice. She would always remember this, that he did not raise his voice, that the conversation they had that evening was conducted at the same gentle volume as every other conversation they had ever shared in that apartment, and yet somehow the room itself felt different. The way a familiar place feels different after something important has been said in it. He told her, in a voice that was level and exhausted and very careful, that he knew, and that he had known for some time, and that he was not yet certain what to do with the knowing. She sat across from him at the low table, the tatami beneath them pale in the warmth of the single lamp, and she found that she had very little to say, not because she was concealing anything further, but because the truth, once named aloud, did not seem to require elaboration. There was tea on the table between them, growing cold in its cups, and neither of them reached for it, and outside the window the plum tree continued its quiet blooming, entirely indifferent to what was being said indoors. Long pause. What followed was a difficult time. She would not minimize this, would never have tried, a time of long silences and carefully prepared meals and the specific, unglamorous sorrow of two people who have loved each other trying to understand what form, if any, that love might still be able to take. Her husband was thorough in his grief, as he was thorough in all things, and he made certain decisions methodically with the same deliberate care he brought to everything else in his life, including the decision to contact the company where they both worked. The company received the information with a certain institutional gravity, as mid-sized firms do. Quiet meetings behind closed doors, careful language in formal emails, the machinery of internal protocol engaging with a situation it had encountered in some form or another before. The section chief was a senior employee, a man who had been with the company for over a decade, and the matter of what to do with the information was handled through the appropriate administrative channels, in the measured and non-committal language of internal review. Breath. She was asked by people in formal positions to give an account of herself, and she did so, sitting in a small conference room on a Tuesday morning in April, the cherry blossoms just visible through the glass of the window, speaking in the same quiet and deliberate voice she might have used to present a quarterly summary. The section chief was moved to a different apartment. She understood this without being told the specifics, simply from the way certain hallways became quieter and certain meeting invitations stopped appearing in her calendar, the way water redistributes when a stone is lifted from a stream. She continued to come to work each morning, to take the same train, to pass through the same glass doors, and the ordinary texture of the days returned, or something closely resembling it returned, a texture similar to the ordinary, but feeling, when she pressed against it, subtly and permanently different. Colleagues were kind, in the particular way that colleagues in Japanese offices tend to be kind, attentive without intrusion, present without pressure, offering nothing that could be mistaken for judgment, and withholding nothing that could be mistaken for coldness. Pause. Her husband did not ask her to leave, and she did not leave, and this was not a decision made in a single conversation, but something that emerged over many weeks of shared mornings and shared dinners and the slow, careful, largely wordless work of two people trying to find each other again in a space that had grown uncertain. There were evenings when the silence between them was simply silence, comfortable even in its quiet way, and evenings when it held something heavier, something that neither of them tried to force into language, letting it sit between them the way the untouched tea had sat on the table that March evening. She found herself, in those months, paying attention to small things with an intensity she had not felt in years. The sound of rain on the apartment roof, the particular creak of the second floorboard in the hallway, the way the light in the kitchen changed color in the hour before dark. It was as though, having lost her bearings in a large and obvious way, she had returned to the smallest possible scale of things, finding a kind of orientation in the precise weight of a ceramic cup or the exact temperature of the water she used to rinse the rice each morning. Breath. Her husband made no demands and offered no ultimatums. He was, in this as in everything, consistent. He simply continued to be himself, to fold his newspaper, to check the weather forecast, to place her umbrella by the door on mornings when rain was expected. And it was in witnessing this consistency day after day, in the weeks and months of their difficult rebuilding, that she came to feel something she had not expected, something that was not quite gratitude, not quite love reassembled, but a kind of quiet recognition that had not been available to her before. She recognized, she came slowly to understand, the exact shape of what she had nearly lost, not as an abstraction, not as a category called marriage or trust or companionship, but in the specific and irreplaceable form of a man who still, without comment, placed her umbrella by the door. Pause. The section chief, she heard through the indirect channels by which such information travels in offices, eventually moved to a branch location in a different city, not in disgrace, exactly, but quietly, in a way that professional consequences tend to move people when the matter has been handled with institutional discretion and no desire for drama. She thought of him rarely in the years that followed, and when she did, it was not with bitterness or longing, but with a kind of tired neutrality, the feeling of looking at a photograph of a place one visited long ago and finding that the place no longer holds the charge one had expected it to hold. Summer came, and in the thick heat of late summer, when Tokyo becomes a city of shadows and cool interiors and late evening walks along the river, and she and her husband began, without discussing it, to take those walks together most evenings. The walks were quiet, largely, and required very little conversation, and she found in them something she had not known she was missing. The river moving steadily alongside them, the city breathing around them in the warm dark, the particular piece of two people walking in the same direction without needing to explain where they were going. Pause. By the time autumn returned, The persimmon tree in the courtyard of the office was heavy with its orange fruit, and she noticed it one afternoon from the window near her desk. The window she now sat beside in a corner of the room, slightly further from where he used to be, and felt, when she looked at it, nothing in particular which felt in itself like a kind of arrival. The months that followed were not unmarked by difficulty. There were still conversations to navigate, understanding still to be reached, a slow and undramatic rebuilding that did not announce itself but simply continued, the way a wall is raised in small and careful courses, each one dependent on the solidity of the one beneath. She was not the same person she had been before that particular autumn. She understood this, held it without distress, simply as a fact, the way one understands that a river has changed its course even if the valley it passes through remains otherwise familiar. And her husband, she came to observe, had also changed in some ways, had become more deliberate, more present, as though what had happened had clarified something for him about what he valued and how he wished to spend the particular and finite hours of his mornings. Long pause. There is a Japanese expression she had learned once, in a high school classroom reading an old poem, and thought little of at the time. Mono no aware, the bittersweet sorrow of passing things, the understanding that what is beautiful and what is impermanent belong naturally to each other. She had understood it then as something one was supposed to appreciate, a concept from the literature she was expected to carry forward, correct in its way, but abstract, belonging to the page rather than to anything she had yet lived. She came to feel it, finally, in those quiet autumn evenings by the river, not as a concept, but as something lived in the body, in the particular and unremarkable weight of a husband's hand when he reached, without comment or ceremony, to take her umbrella and tuck it under his arm. Pause. The city moved around them as cities do, indifferent and continuous, trains arriving and departing on their known schedules, lights coming on in office windows at the same hours each evening, the river carrying its old green smell through the cooling air. She would not say, if anyone had asked, that everything had been made right. That was not the word she would have chosen, and she had become, through those difficult months, more careful than ever about the words she chose. What she would say, in the careful and private language she had developed for the interior of her own understanding, was that something had found its level, that the water, having risen and then receded, had settled at a depth that was habitable, that she could move through without effort. Her husband's care, which she had once taken so thoroughly for granted that she had ceased to notice it entirely, was now visible to her in a way it had not been before. Visible the way a familiar landscape becomes visible when seen, for the very first time, in the soft and particular light of late afternoon. Breath. She would carry the memory of those 2 years for the rest of her life. She understood, not as a wound that needed tending, nor as a regret that demanded rehearsal, but as a kind of understanding that one carries quietly in the chest, weightless on most days, present always. And there was something in the carrying of it, she came to find, that had made her gentler than she had been before, gentler with herself, with the people around her, with the complicated and ordinary and irreplaceable fact of being alive inside a life that was both chosen and still, in some ways, becoming. Outside the apartment window, on the evening this part of the story settles into stillness. The plum tree that had bloomed in such difficult light 2 years before was blooming again, as it would bloom each year regardless of what had been said or left unsaid beneath it, in the way that living things do what living things do. Pause. She was in the kitchen, washing rice in cold water, listening through the open doorway to the sound of the television in the next room, where her husband had settled for the evening and the apartment was warm, and the evening was ordinary, and the ordinary was, for now, more than enough. And that perhaps is as close to rest as most lives come. Not the resolution of everything, not the closing of all the doors that were opened carelessly, but the quiet return to the small and daily, the cup of tea cooling on the table, the umbrella by the door, the river continuing its patient and unhurried passage toward the sea. The chapter of those 2 difficult years had not closed so much as softened with time, the way a pressed flower softens in the pages of a book, still there, still legible to anyone who chose to look closely, but no longer sharp at its edges, no longer carrying the particular weight of the freshly fallen. She continued, as people continue, putting one morning gently after another, setting the table for 2, taking the morning train, watching the persimmon tree pass through its seasons in the courtyard of the office, heavy with fruit in autumn, bare and patient through winter, and then, quietly and inevitably, finding its way again to bloom. Pause. And that, for tonight, is where this story rests. Not in resolution, but in the slow and ordinary grace of 2 people sitting in a warm apartment as the evening deepens, the river nearby, the plum tree outside, the tea cooling between them, everything ordinary, everything still. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it fade the way a dream fades when you don't try to hold it, dissolving softly into the dark behind your eyes. There is no hurry. You can rest here for a moment, in the space between one story and the next, a slow breath in and out, the weight of your body settling a little deeper into wherever you lie. Our next story takes us to a quiet patience that took years to ripen, the kind that grows in silence, unhurried, like something planted in autumn and forgotten until spring. Let your thoughts drift. Let them go wherever they need to go, or nowhere at all. We will begin again gently when you are ready. Somewhere in the slow middle of that particular autumn, when the maple leaves were still holding their color and the mornings arrived with a muted, unhurried softness, the legal proceedings began in earnest. The man whose name we will simply call Hiroshi had spent many months learning to live in an apartment that felt larger than it should, with rooms that had been rearranged by absence and by the particular silence that follows a departure. He had learned, in a way that many people learn such things, not through wisdom but through necessity, that grief and anger are often the same feeling wearing different clothes, and that telling them apart is slow, careful work. His lawyer, a woman in her late 40s with a reputation for measured precision and a voice that seemed never to rise above a certain calm register, had reviewed the documents with him over several evenings at her office. She had mentioned, in her careful way, that the case was clear in its facts, that the law was clear as well, and that clarity, in her long experience, was often the gentlest form of relief available in situations such as this one. The other side had retained counsel as well, a man considerably older, who moved through the world with the particular confidence of someone who had spent decades in rooms where his opinions went largely unchallenged and had not often been asked to revise them. Hiroshi had not expected much from those early proceedings, not victory precisely, and not defeat either, but something closer to the exhausting arithmetic of loss, the slow counting of what had been taken and what the law might, in its careful way, return. He remembered sitting in the waiting area before the first session, watching the late afternoon light fall at a shallow angle through a narrow window, and finding himself thinking that the light looked the same as it always had, indifferent and pale and quietly golden. The conference room where they gathered was not what anyone would call dramatic. A plain table, chairs arranged without ceremony, a stack of papers at the center that seemed to carry the whole weight of what had happened between two people who had once, in another season, chosen each other. It was during that first formal exchange that the opposing counsel said something which settled into the room like smoke, not announced, not raised in volume, but spoken quietly enough to be almost casual, as though it were a thing that barely required saying. He murmured, and murmured is the word that those present would use later, as though the smallness of his delivery somehow reduced the weight of it, that a man seeking damages of this nature was unusual, that a man ought to find his own way through such things, that this was not, in his considered view, the proper role of a husband before the court. The words were old-fashioned in the way that certain kinds of unkindness are old-fashioned, rooted in a world that had once made a particular kind of sense to certain people and had since grown strange and narrow around them without their noticing. Hiroshi's lawyer paused for a moment. The kind of pause that is not uncertainty, but something closer to a deliberate breath, the gathering of something quiet and necessary before the act of speaking. She replied softly and with the measured evenness of someone who had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for exactly this kind of moment across a very long career. She noted, in her careful voice, that the law made no distinction based on the role of husband or wife, that the harm recorded in the documents before them was the harm done, and that the room in which they sat was not one where assumptions of that kind carried any legal standing. The opposing counsel seemed, for a moment, to reconsider, not dramatically, not in any outward way that anyone would call a retreat, but in the small physical language of someone who has misjudged the temperature of a room, a slight shift in posture, a brief downward glance at the papers. Hiroshi watched all of this with a kind of distant clarity that he would later describe to a friend as the feeling of standing very still while something moves past you in the dark, a motion sensed more than seen, register in the body before the mind catches up. In the days that followed, the proceedings continued in the way that such things do, methodically and without theater, each document examined in its order, each figure reviewed, each piece of evidence considered according to its proper weight and place. The older lawyer's remark, though it had occupied only a few seconds of one morning, became a thread that Hiroshi's counsel drew carefully through the subsequent sessions. Not as a weapon, not as a point of personal attack, but as a quiet reminder to the room of what had been said and what the saying of it revealed about the underlying argument. Legal proceedings are, in many ways, slow rivers, and those who navigate them must learn a kind of patience that is different from ordinary patience. Less resignation, more attentiveness, the waiting of someone who has come to understand that time itself is a form of argument. There were days when Hiroshi did not attend, when the technical sessions required only the lawyers, and on those days he would sit instead in a small cafe near the station and watch the street outside the window and feel, for a few hours, something approaching ordinary. He drank tea on those mornings, strong and plain, without additions. And sometimes he would think about the woman who had been his wife, not with the bitterness that had been so sharp in the early weeks, but with the quieter and more puzzling bewilderment of someone trying to understand a sentence written in a language they had believed they knew. She had been present at several sessions, seated across the table with her own counsel beside her, and Hiroshi found, to a mild surprise that he had not entirely expected, that looking at her no longer felt the way he had imagined it would feel. There was no sudden wave of feeling, no particular collapse, only a kind of tired recognition, the way one recognizes an old house that has changed ownership, familiar in its shape and its proportions, but no longer, in any meaningful sense, one's own. The man who had been involved with her had retained his own separate counsel and remained, by all accounts, largely silent throughout the proceedings, offering little and volunteering nothing, and seemed in some way to grow smaller in the room as the weeks accumulated, as though the process itself carried a slow diminishment. This was not something Hiroshi took any particular satisfaction in, or so he would recall later with the honesty that comes from distance, because by that point he had moved past the phase of wanting anyone to feel something at his direction. What he wanted, he found, was simpler and harder to put into words, something like the restoration of a quiet, the sense that the chapter had a last page, that the story would come to rest somewhere he could recognize and leave behind. Outside the building, in those weeks of proceedings, autumn was doing what autumn does in that part of the world, arriving without fanfare, cooling the air by degrees, softening the edges of the city into something more like a watercolor made for memory. Hiroshi had grown up in a house with a small garden that his mother tended with care and with patience, and he had the kind of attentiveness to seasonal change that comes from childhood spent noticing things. The day the persimmons deepened on the branch, the morning when the first frost lay along the stone lantern at the gate. He thought about that garden sometimes, on the train home from the long afternoon sessions, watching the city give way to suburb and suburb give way to the darker, quieter country of residential streets. His apartment was modest and organized in the particular way of a space that has been quietly rearranged after a departure. A chair moved slightly, a shelf reorganized, objects that had been shared and were now simply his settled into new positions that felt tentative at first, and then, with time, simply correct. A neighbor, an older woman who had lived in the building for many years, and said little beyond careful greetings in the hallway, had knocked on his door one evening with a small dish of sweet potatoes she had prepared and had offered them with almost no words, which he understood to be a neighborhood's gentle acknowledgement, its way of saying that it had noticed and that it was not unkind. He ate the sweet potatoes that evening at the low table by the window, watching the lights of the city arrange themselves against the dark in their familiar patient patterns, and felt, for a moment he had not anticipated and did not try to hold, something like warmth returning to the room. The resolution, when it finally arrived, did not arrive as a declaration or a sudden ending, but in the manner that such things tend to arrive, as a series of quiet confirmations, of documents signed and figures agreed upon, and the formal language of settlement laid over what had been, at its root, a very human and ordinary kind of sorrow. The opposing counsel's comments had served, in the end, a purpose he had not intended. They had drawn attention quietly but persistently to the weakness of the position being argued, suggesting that the case rested not on evidence, but on assumptions that the proceedings did not share and would not accommodate. Hiroshi's lawyer had navigated all of this with the same unhurried precision she had shown from the very beginning, and when the matter was concluded, she told him, in a tone that was warm without being celebratory, that the outcome was fair, and that fair was precisely what they had sought. He thanked her, and she replied gently that he had been a patient client, which he understood to mean that he had not made her work harder than the situation required. And this, too, felt like a small and sincere kindness. The woman who had been his wife and the man who had been her companion both encountered the consequences the law had determined, not in any dramatic or publicly lasting sense, but in the quieter, administrative way that such things often resolve, through paperwork and obligation and the slow rearrangement of the financial arrangements of a life. Hiroshi did not follow what happened to them in the months after, or not with any real attention. He had come to understand that following such things was its own kind of burden, a tether that kept him facing the wrong direction when there was so much that lay the other way. What he knew, from the summary his lawyer had provided, was that the matter had concluded as it had concluded, each party moving into a new arrangement of their days, changed in ways that would take years to fully become visible even to themselves. The older lawyer, the one whose remarks had drawn so much quiet, careful attention throughout, did not appear in any subsequent proceedings that Hiroshi was aware of. But this, too, he released without effort, because holding the details of another person's consequence was not something he had the will for anymore. In the months that followed, Hiroshi found himself doing the things that people do when they are, slowly and without any announcement, becoming themselves again. Cooking meals he had not made in a long time, calling his mother on weekday evenings, walking in the mornings through the park near his building where the ginkgo trees stood in their yellow autumn coats like old advisors who had seen many seasons pass. He had a friend from his school years who lived 2 stations away, and they began meeting on Sunday evenings to eat ramen at a small counter place. Neither of them could remember who had first suggested, and these evenings became something he looked forward to in the way that one looks forward to ordinary things, with a quiet gratitude that does not require examination or explanation. He was not entirely healed, and he did not pretend to be. Healing, he had come to understand through those months, was not a destination one arrived at, but a direction one moved in slowly and with patience and with occasional rests along the way. There were still mornings when he woke and felt the weight of the preceding years settle over him before he had fully risen from sleep. Like a heavy blanket he had to fold carefully and set aside before the day could properly begin. But those mornings grew less frequent, and their heaviness grew lighter, and the folding and setting aside became, in time, almost practiced, the way any repeated gesture becomes part of the body's quiet, unthinking knowledge. His mother visited once, in the early part of winter, bringing with her a small plant she had grown from a cutting in her garden back home. Something with pale, narrow leaves and the reputation, she said, of growing quietly without needing much attention. She placed it on the windowsill in a simple terracotta pot and told him that it liked the morning light and did not need much water. And he understood, without difficulty, that she was also telling him something else, something she did not have the words for directly, but felt he was ready, in his quiet way, to hear. He kept the plant on the windowsill through the rest of that winter, and it grew in the manner she had described, unhurried, without urgency, adding a leaf here and extending a small new stem there, content with the light the window offered and patient with whatever came beyond it. What had happened to him was not a small thing. He did not diminish it, even in the soft language of retrospect, even in the gentler versions of the story he told himself on quiet evenings. But it had, in some way he could not yet fully articulate, made him more attentive to the weight of ordinary days. He noticed things now that he had perhaps moved past too quickly in the years before. The smell of rain on pavement outside the station, the sound of his neighbor's radio coming softly through the wall on weekday evenings, the way the light in his kitchen changed in the hour between 7 and 8 in the morning, sliding from gray into a pale and tentative gold along the edge of the counter. These were small things, and he was aware that they were small, but he had come to feel that small things were not small in the way the word implied, that they were in fact the very texture of a life, the substance beneath the larger events that we so often mistake for the whole meaning. The legal matter had been, in the end, a kind of container for what he had been carrying, a formal shape that allowed a formless grief to have edges, to be carried from one room to another and set down at last somewhere. It could be measured and named, and after a time, left behind. He was grateful for that. In the particular way one is grateful for something that was difficult and necessary, the way one is grateful for a surgeon's steady hand, even while regretting entirely the need for surgery. His lawyer had been right that clarity was a form of relief, and he had found, as the weeks became months and the months settled into a new year, that she had also been right in the manner she had said it, gently, without overstatement, as an observation rather than a promise. By the time that new year arrived, with its cool, particular quality of beginning, clean and tentative and full of quiet possibility, he had begun to feel something that was not yet happiness, but was perhaps neighboring it, an openness, a willingness to see what came next without assuming it would follow the shape of what had already passed. The plant on the windowsill continued to grow in its patient, unhurried way, and he thought sometimes that it was a good companion for that particular time, something that expected nothing of him, that was content simply to occupy the same room, to share the morning light without demand or comment. And so, in the soft arithmetic of ordinary time, the story found its way to something like stillness. Not the stillness of erasure, not the pretense that none of it had happened, but the stillness of a river that has moved through difficult country and arrived, at last, at a wider and quieter channel where the current is gentler and the banks are known. There are many such stories, told in the small hours across cities and towns and quiet residential streets everywhere. Stories of people moving through loss and paperwork and the careful reconstruction of a life's arrangement, arriving somewhere they had not planned and could not have chosen, but could, with time and with patience, come slowly to recognize as home. And Hiroshi, on a winter evening with the plant on the sill and the ramen cooling in the bowl, and his phone lit with a message from his friend about the following Sunday, allowed himself to sit quietly in the middle of that ordinary evening and simply be inside it, without reaching forward and without pulling away. And that, perhaps, is where this chapter rests for tonight. In the quiet of a winter room, with the small sounds of the city continuing beyond the glass, and a small plant growing, unhurried, in whatever light the morning chooses to bring. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it grow quiet and small, the way a sound fades when you walk away from it and never quite remember the moment it disappeared. There is no hurry here. If you need to breathe, breathe. Let your shoulders settle a little further into the warmth beneath you. Let your hands grow heavy and still. The night is long and patient, and it holds you. Our next story takes us to a quiet patience that took years to ripen. Years of small, unhurried mornings of waiting without quite knowing what was being waited for. Rest for just a moment. We are in no rush to begin. She was a woman who had learned, long before any of this, the particular stillness that settles in when the mind grows quieter than the storm surrounding it. And it was that stillness, soft and unhurried as morning fog over a canal, that would carry her through everything which followed. Her name, in this telling, will simply be Misa, and she had been married for 6 years to a man she had once believed she understood the way you understand the layout of a room you have lived in for a very long time. Their apartment in Setagaya was small, as many Tokyo apartments are small, with a narrow galley kitchen and walls so thin she could sometimes hear her neighbor's television murmuring low on the other side, soft as a radio left on in another room. She had made a life there, arranging small things with care, a teapot with a chip on the lid she had never replaced, a shelf of books with softened spines, curtains that caught and held the amber glow of the street lamps below in the evenings. She had learned the sounds of that apartment the way one learns a language slowly, without noticing, the particular noise the floorboard made near the gen-can, the way the heating clicked and settled on cold mornings, the sound of rain on the narrow balcony. Pause. It was the middle of an ordinary Wednesday, the kind that arrives without ceremony and leaves the same way, that she first noticed something in the texture of her days had shifted very slightly, the way the light sometimes shifts before rain. She had found a message, not because she had gone looking, but because life will occasionally arrange for such things to surface without warning, The way old letters slip from between the pages of books you haven't opened in years, reminding you of what you had set aside. She read it once, and then read it again, and then set down her phone on the kitchen counter and stood for a moment looking at the wall, where a small calendar hung with a few dates circled in pencil. The city outside continued its quiet evening business. Taxis moving through the rain-wet streets below, someone's bicycle bell marking a moment somewhere, and then going silent again. The ordinary sounds of a city settling into its evening. She did not cry, not immediately, though the feeling was there and present, waiting like a coat she had not yet decided whether to put on, and she recognized, distantly, that this restraint was not coldness, but something more like the body's instinct to finish understanding before it begins to grieve. Pause. What she felt most clearly, she would later say, was not the sharp thing she had expected, not betrayal's bright hard edge, but something softer and sadder, the feeling that a door she had believed was solid had been hollow all along, and the knowledge of that was stranger in its way than anger. She made tea because it was the kind of evening that required tea, and she sat at the dining table with the cup warming both hands, watching the steam rise and thin and dissolve against the kitchen light, and she let herself simply sit with what she had learned. The message had come from someone at Kenji's company, and she understood enough from those few careful lines to know this was not a thing that had begun yesterday, or last month, or perhaps even the season before that. Pause. There's a particular quality to the grief of discovering that ordinary days of dinner and laundry and small talk and choosing what to watch, have been running alongside other days hidden that you knew nothing of, and Misa sat with that quality for a long time before she moved. She was, by her own nature, a person who preferred to understand a situation fully and from all sides before she decided anything. Not because she was slow, but because she was thorough, the way a seamstress measures twice before cutting, not out of distrust of herself, but out of respect for what the fabric requires. Kenji came home at his usual hour, a little past 9, his jacket over his arm, his shoes making their familiar sound in the entryway. And she listened to those sounds as though hearing them for the first time, the way you sometimes hear music you have always known and notice suddenly what it actually says. Breath. She gave no sign, poured his tea, set out the bowl of rice she had made earlier in the evening, and sat across the low table while he talked about a meeting that had run long, his voice carrying its usual end-of-day tiredness, which she received now with a different quality of attention. She nodded when he paused, offered the small sounds of listening that she had always offered, and watched him the way you might watch weather moving across a distant hillside, with complete attention, but without any urgency to intervene. That night she lay in the dark beside him and listened to the rain, which had returned, and to his breathing, which was soon the slow breathing of sleep, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about clarity. Not what to do, not yet, but what was true. Long pause. In the days that followed, she did not confront him, not yet, because she was still learning the full shape of what had happened. The way you walk slowly around something large to understand how large it truly is, measuring it in your own time. She spoke to a friend, quietly, over the phone one afternoon while Kenji was at the office, and her friend listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was the kind of listening that meant the most in those particular days. Her friend asked, gently, what she intended to do, and Misa paused for a long moment before saying only that she had not quite decided yet, though in some quieter part of herself, something had already been decided. She simply had not finished arriving there. She was not a person given to scenes or raised voices. The kind of confrontation that shatters dishes and wakes neighbors in the night had never been in her nature. But she had other capacities, quieter ones, and more lasting in their effect. She began, carefully and without any haste, to understand the finances of their shared life, which she had always been competent at managing, but had not previously studied with this particular quality of attention, this patient forensic curiosity. Pause. She made notes in a small notebook with a gray cover, the kind sold at stationery shops near train stations. Her handwriting in those pages is careful and unhurried as everything else she did when it mattered. She noted the accounts and their numbers, the shared holdings and the separate ones, the patterns of withdrawal that over time told a story she had not been told, readable now, clear and cool, the way weather's clear after rain. She photographed documents with her phone, not with any feeling of drama, but with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who understands that memory is imperfect and that what you can hold in your hand is more reliable than what you carry only in your mind. Kenji, meanwhile, continued to come home to eat, to watch television with one eye drifting to his phone, to say good night and turn off the lamp on his side of the bed. All the ordinary movements of a man who did not yet know that the ordinary was ending. Pause. She found herself thinking, during those evenings, of her mother, who had once said that the most powerful thing a person can hold on to in difficult times is clarity. Not anger, not sorrow, but the simple, clear knowledge of what is true. She had not fully understood that when she first heard it, had thought it the kind of thing that sounds wiser in proverb than in practice, but she understood it now, sitting at the table with her gray notebook and her cooling cup of tea. After 3 weeks, she arranged a dinner, quietly, with no announcement of its purpose, and invited both his parents and her own to the apartment, cooking most of the afternoon. Miso soup with silken tofu and wakame, grilled fish with daikon, rice, and the pickled plum his mother always said she looked forward to. It was from the outside, an entirely ordinary family dinner, warm with the small conversations that such gatherings carry. How is your health? How is work? The grandchildren growing so tall, the autumn coming early this year. Breath. The sake was poured, the fish was praised, and for a time she let it simply be what it appeared to be, a family sitting together in a small apartment in Setagaya, the city quiet outside, the dishes warm. And then, at the end of the meal, before the cups were cleared, she spoke, gently, without drama, in the calm way a doctor presents findings, the evidence arranged and readable. And what she spoke was simply what was true. She had not rehearsed any cruelty into it. There was no cruelty in her, not that evening, only the particular composure of someone who has spent 3 weeks in the company of what is real and has learned to say it plainly. Kenji had gone very still, the way a person goes still when the room they are in has changed shape around them, and both sets of parents received what she said in a silence that held many different feelings: surprise, sorrow, the recognition that what they were hearing could not be unheard. Pause. She had chosen this moment not out of a desire to humiliate, but out of a deeper conviction that certain truths, once they exist, should not be held by only one person in a room, that the weight of what is known is lightened when it is shared, even when sharing it is difficult. Her voice throughout remained steady, not because she felt nothing, but because the feeling had moved through her during those long evenings with the notebook and the tea, and what remained now was simply the truth present in the room, quietly undeniable. The dinner ended earlier than it might have, and there followed a period of necessary difficulty, as there always does when the architecture of a shared life is being looked at clearly by all the people it has held for the first time. Long pause. Kenji moved to stay with a colleague, and the apartment became hers alone for the first time, which felt at first both strange and too quiet, and then, gradually, simply quiet, the quieter she had forgotten she preferred. She kept the teapot with the chipped lid, and the books, and the curtains, and the succulent on the windowsill, which had developed a small new growth from one side sometime during those months, reaching toward the glass with a patience she found unexpectedly admirable. There were meetings with a lawyer, a calm woman who wore sensible shoes and spoke with great precision, and documents with many pages, and conversations that required saying certain things in careful words, which was tiring in the way that purposeful work is tiring, exhausting but purposeful, with a direction at the end. Pause. Her mother came to stay for 10 days during those months, sleeping on the fold-out futon in the narrow second room, and each morning, without being asked, made miso soup, the smell of it filling the small kitchen before Misa had finished washing her face. They would sit together at the dining table in the early morning before the city had fully woken, with the soup and rice and whatever pickled thing was left from the day before, and they did not always talk, which was its own kind of comfort. Her mother's presence was, more than anything else during those weeks, a reminder that she had not been wrong to expect more from her life, that the standard she had held and been disappointed by was not an unreasonable one. Breath, the settlement, when it came, was fair. She had quietly ensured it would be, in those patient evenings with the gray notebook. And when the last document was signed and the last meeting finished, she walked out onto the street in the afternoon light and stood for a moment, simply breathing. She did not think of it as victory, because victory suggests a contest, and what she had moved through in those months felt less like a contest and more like a long and careful reckoning, the kind that happens in small rooms, with tea in the spaces between the hours that other people see. Pause. A year after the evening that had changed everything, she accepted an invitation to a birthday gathering for a friend, held in a small bar near Shimikitazawa, with wooden stools and low shelves of bottles, and jazz playing soft enough that you didn't notice it until you had been there a while and the room had begun to feel comfortable. She wore a coat she had bought that spring, a soft gray one with deep pockets that she could put her hands into, and she took the train alone, which she had grown accustomed to now and no longer felt as a kind of diminishment. She sat with her friends and drank one glass of wine, and talked about small things, the restaurant one of them had discovered in Sanganjaya, a film that had been worth the time, the first signs of winter in the morning air, the kind of talk that matters precisely because it is unrushed and unheavy. Pause. At some point in the evening, she laughed, a real one, arriving without preparation, in response to something her friend said that landed at just the right angle. And afterwards she noticed that the laugh had felt entirely natural and unguarded, which struck her as worth paying quiet attention to. She took the last train home, the car nearly empty, the city sliding past the window in its familiar nighttime arrangement. Lit windows in apartment buildings, the dark of small parks and narrow rivers, the bright pause of each station platform, and then the dark again. In the apartment, she hung her coat, put the kettle on out of long habit, and stood at the window for a while, looking down at the street below, which was quiet now, a bicycle leaning against the corner post, a cat moving along the edge of the pavement with that particular unhurried certainty that cats carry everywhere they go. Breath. She thought about the years of the marriage, not with the sharpness that had once accompanied such thoughts, but with something more like the feeling of turning old photographs over in your hands. You can see them clearly, you understand what they are, but they no longer pull you in the direction they once did. She thought about what she had come to understand during that difficult year, which was not any single lesson she could name cleanly, but more a texture. That composure is not the same as coldness, that patience is not the same as surrender, and that knowing your own worth clearly and without drama is perhaps the quietest form of strength there is. The kettle began to whisper, then softly to whistle, as she turned from the window to attend to it, carrying the warmth back to the table where she had sat so many evenings before in so many different states of mind. The apartment was warm. The lamp in the corner made a small circle of light, and outside the city had grown very quiet in the way it grows quiet after midnight, when the streets belong to rain and foxes and the last few taxis navigating the wide, empty avenues. Pause. She opened the book she had been reading, a slow novel, the kind that takes its time with every room it enters and rewards the patience you bring to it, which seemed, for this particular hour, exactly right. After a while, she found herself reading the same sentence twice, not because she had not understood it, but because her attention was drifting downward, the way attention drifts in a warm room at a late hour when the day has finished asking what it needed to ask and received its answers. She set the book down, finished the last of the tea, and sat for a moment in the stillness, her hands folded in her lap, the same posture she recognized that she had held on that Wednesday evening a year ago, when everything was just beginning to change. But the stillness now was different, not the stillness of gathering oneself before something difficult, but the kind that comes after, the quieter kind, the kind that requires nothing from you and asks nothing and simply is. Pause. She turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the corner lamp, and moved through the apartment in the unhurried way of someone who has grown genuinely comfortable in her own company, which is a thing that takes time to arrive at and is worth the time. She paused at the windowsill and touched the succulent briefly as she passed, its new growth still there, still reaching, somewhat larger now than it had been in those earlier months. She had come to feel, over the course of that year, that this small apartment, which had once felt like only half a life, was simply a life, whole and unhurried, shaped by her own preferences, filled at the pace she chose, requiring nothing she was unwilling to give. And that, perhaps, is where this part of the story rests tonight. Not at any single bright moment of resolution, but with a woman making her way to bed at the end of an ordinary evening, in a warm room, in a city that is itself settling into sleep. Outside, the rain had begun again, very softly, the way it often begins in Tokyo when you are not quite paying attention, a gentle sound against the window glass, unhurried, present, asking nothing of anyone, simply falling in the slow and patient way of all things that belong to the night. And in the small apartment, with the lamp dimmed and the rain at the window and the book closed on the table, she slept, and the sleep was, by all the quiet signs of it, a restful one. And so we leave that hallway behind, its shadows settling quietly into the past where they belong. You have traveled far tonight, through other people's lives, other people's silences, and there is no hurry now to go anywhere at all. If you would like to simply rest here for a moment, eyes closed, breath slowing, the night holds you gently and asks nothing of you. Take one long, easy breath in and let it go. Our next story takes us to a quiet patience that took years to ripen, a waiting that was not passive, but tender, the way a seed waits beneath winter ground without complaint. When you are ready, whenever that is, let the words carry you there like water, finding its own still level. Somewhere in the middle of a marriage, there are years that accumulate slowly and without announcement, like the soft drift of paper on still water, moving without anyone choosing a direction. This is a story about a misunderstanding, not the small kind that resolves itself over dinner, but the larger and slower kind, the sort that lives inside a person for so long that it begins to feel like the truth. The man in this story was a quiet one, the kind of man who read documents before signing them and kept his receipts in a small folder beside the kitchen counter. And he and his wife had shared a narrow apartment on a side street in the city for several years, close enough to the train line that the windows rattled faintly at certain hours of the evening. She would later remember the early years of the marriage as something warm, in a way that photographs of warm things can feel warm even long after the warmth itself is gone. Pause. The mornings had been simple then. 2 bowls of rice set side by side on the low table. The murmur of the morning news playing softly on the television, and his hand resting briefly on her shoulder as he passed through the kitchen on his way to work. Neither of them could have said, later, exactly when things began to change, because such changes rarely announce themselves. They arrive the way a season does, not on any particular day, but in the accumulated weight of many small differences. She began spending evenings away from the apartment, first occasionally and then with more regularity, and the explanations she offered were never quite specific and never quite needed to be. Her husband noticed, in the way that quiet people do, not with accusations, not with confrontation, but with a slow and interior noting, a cataloging of absences he kept to himself while he decided what to do with what he was learning. She came home later, and when she was home, she was somehow elsewhere, and the space between them at the table and in the bed grew in that particular way that space grows when it is never acknowledged, never named, simply allowed to widen like a crack in a wall that no one mentions. Pause. And he, being the careful and methodical person he had always been, began, in his unhurried way, to gather information. He spoke with a lawyer, once and then again, in the quiet way of someone who prefers to understand a situation fully before acting on it. And the picture that formed was a clear one, laid out in ordinary legal terms. His wife, in those same months, had arrived at a conclusion of her own, and it was a conclusion she had come to carry with considerable certainty. She had grown to feel, somewhere in the slow drift of her reasoning, somewhere in the tangle of feelings she had built around herself like a shelter, that the distance in their marriage had been her husband's doing, that his quietness was a form of absence, his steadiness a kind of coldness, and that she had simply been a person responding to a neglect he had created. It is not uncommon, when we are the ones who have moved away, to tell ourselves a story in which we are the ones who were left behind. Pause. She had come to feel, with the particular conviction of someone who has rehearsed a story many times, that she was owed something, a fresh beginning, a home of her own, something clean and unencumbered by the accumulated silences of years. And so one evening, with the amber light of the street lamp falling through the thin curtains and the distant sound of a train fading into the quiet, she came to him with a proposal. She told him she wanted a new residence, a place she could move into, something provided by him. And she framed the request using the concept of a sherio, the Japanese word for reparation, for the compensation one owes when one has caused harm to another, as though this were a thing that was simply and straightforwardly due to her. She spoke with the confidence of someone who has already decided the answer and is simply waiting for confirmation. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Pause. He did not raise his voice because raising his voice was not something he did, and also because there was no need to, because what he knew was very clear and very simple, and clarity he had found over many years requires very little volume. He told her, gently and without any particular urgency, that she had described the situation accurately in one respect. There was indeed a party in this circumstance who had caused harm and was therefore, under the law, the one who owed reparation to the other, but that she had the direction of the obligation entirely reversed. The one who owed, he observed quietly, was not him. Pause. It was, in the simplest and clearest terms, her. He did not repeat this, and he did not press it, and then he waited, in the manner of patient people, for understanding to arrive. It arrived slowly, the way understanding sometimes must, because it had to travel a considerable distance to reach her, across the narrative she had built, through the careful architecture of the version of herself she had brought into the room. Long pause. The misunderstanding, when she finally saw the shape of it, had the quality of something that could only have grown in the dark, in the absence of scrutiny, so complete that she had never paused to examine the map she was following, never looked up long enough to compare it with the territory it claimed to represent. She had been certain, and she had been entirely and essentially wrong, And those two things sat together in the quiet of the living room while the city continued its ordinary evening outside the curtains. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The apartment held that silence the way apartments do, without commentary, without judgment, with the particular neutrality of walls that have absorbed many kinds of silence and will absorb many more. Outside, the city went on as cities do. Someone cooking in the apartment above them, the careful footsteps of a neighbor passing through the hallway, the distant sound of a bicycle bell fading into the evening air. The kettle stood where it always stood on the counter, and the small calendar on the wall showed a month they had entered together and would leave in the ways that mattered most separately. The conversations that followed over the next weeks and months were not, by any measure, comfortable ones. There were meetings with lawyers on both sides, documents that required careful reading and signatures, and there was the slow, mechanical sadness of a marriage being formally disassembled piece by piece, the way you might take apart something that was once a long time ago, carefully assembled. But through all of it, the man remained what he had always been, measured, unhurried, careful in his speech, not pushing for more than the law allowed, not seeking to humiliate her or to make the process harder than it needed to be. There are people who would say that this restraint was more generosity than the situation required, and they would not be wrong, but that is the nature of quiet people. They tend to act from their own internal standard rather than from the standard the situation might seem to justify. Pause. By winter, the arrangements have been settled, and each of them moved in their separate directions into the next portion of their lives. There were evenings in those weeks of transition when the sheer completeness of what had been misunderstood seemed almost difficult to hold, that the entire architecture of her certainty had rested on a foundation she had never once examined, a direction she had never thought to verify. He moved to a smaller apartment, farther from the train line, and someone who asked him about it later recalled that he mentioned the nights that were very quiet and that he had been sleeping better. She moved to a different neighborhood, to a room in a building where she did not know her neighbors, and she spent a good portion of that first winter simply sitting with what had happened, with the shape of the misunderstanding, with the version of herself she had carried into the living room that evening, so certain and so completely turned in the wrong direction. That kind of reckoning takes time, and she gave it the time it required. She would say, years later, to someone she trusted over tea in a quiet cafe, that what had stayed with her longest was not the legal reality, not even the reversal of everything she had imagined. It was the manner in which he had told her, the quietness of it, the absence of cruelty in how he delivered information that would have given another person more than enough reason to be cruel. Pause. That detail stayed with her longer than the rest. She thought about it on train rides, in the particular hours of the night when sleep sits close but has not yet arrived, in the ordinary pauses of day that her new life was slowly filling in. There is something that lingers she came to feel about being treated more carefully than you may have deserved. Something that sits with you and asks quiet questions long after the event itself has passed. She came to understand, over the slow passage of months and then years, that the version of herself she had carried into that room, so confident in its own story, so thoroughly turned inward, had been someone trying very hard to outrun something she was not yet willing to face. The outrunning had taken her somewhere she had not intended to go, and the distance between where she had ended up and where she had meant to be was not something anyone else had made. Pause. That is, in the end, the quietest kind of lesson, the kind that no one else delivers to you, that you simply find yourself sitting with one day, alone, in the ordinary evenings of the life that comes after. It is a particularly human thing to be too close to one's own story to see the shape of it clearly. Most of us have stood, at some point, in the living room of a situation we had mapped entirely from the inside, certain of our orientation, unaware of what the view from even a small distance might have shown us. Most of the time, we do not have the occasion to see the discrepancy so plainly, so gently corrected by someone who, by any reasonable measure, had cause to be far less gentle about it. The apartment on the side street by the following spring was rented to a young couple who arrived with cardboard boxes and a folding table and the particular warm energy of beginnings. Pause. They would have no way of knowing what had accumulated in those rooms across the years. The miso soup mornings, the evenings when one of them had been somewhere else in all but body, the one conversation held in amber lamplight that had changed everything. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Rooms are generous in that way, receiving whatever life they're given without holding anything against those who pass through them. The train still rattled the windows at certain hours of the evening. The streetlights still cast its amber shape across the floor in the nights. The paper screen in the kitchen still let in a soft and diffused glow on bright mornings, the way it always had, the way it would continue to do long after anyone who had known the previous tenants had forgotten their names. None of it changed, and all of it was different, and that is the particular quality of the spaces where lives have been lived. They continue, and they hold the faint shape of what was in them, even when what was in them is long gone. Pause. Somewhere in the city tonight, there are small apartments with lights burning softly inside them, and behind those lights, there are people trying to understand one another, and perhaps more importantly, trying to understand themselves. Most of the misunderstandings inside those lit rooms will not resolve as plainly as a lawyer's gentle explanation, and most of the reckoning will come not in a single quiet conversation, but over the long, unspectacular passage of ordinary days. What endures in the end is less the story itself than the quality of the silence that settles after. The silence that arrives when all the words have been spoken and the documents signed and the boxes carried to new places. In that silence, people tend to find themselves again, whoever that turns out to be, without the noise and the certainty of the story still surrounding them. The man, by all accounts, continued to be what he had always been, steady and unhurried, the kind of person who pauses before speaking and means what he says when he finally does. The woman became, over time, someone a little more willing to look at herself from the outside, a little more practiced at the difficult and necessary art of standing back far enough to see the whole shape of the map she was carrying. Whether that is a fair exchange for everything that passed between them is not a question with a clean answer. And perhaps the most honest thing is to let it rest without pressing for one. Pause. There's a kind of mercy in allowing a story to end where it ends, without reaching past the ending for a verdict or a lesson it does not quite contain. And so, on this quiet evening, with a soft rain beginning again somewhere over the city and the amber blur of streetlights in the wet pavement below, let this story rest where it has arrived, in the space between what we believe about ourselves and what, in the stillness of a particular moment, turns out to be true. That is where this chapter ends. And perhaps that is where it was always going. Not toward triumph, not toward ruin, but toward the ordinary and ultimately gentle place of understanding. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight. And so, we have come to the end of tonight's stories. The last voice has faded. The last page has turned. There is nothing left now but the quiet and you and the soft dark around you.